Nice to see so many of you joining us today. So today we're going to be hearing a talk from Dr. Bruce Lyon. He's currently a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His research focuses on the evolution of reproductive strategies and the mating behavior of birds. He studied the evolution of brood parasitism and ornamental brood plumage. And he more recently did a decade-long investigation into the winter social lives of migrant golden crowned sparrows that spend their winters at the Arboretum at UC Santa Cruz. And he actually gave a previous birdie hour about that research in 2020. So if you weren't able to catch that, look at the SFBDO website and you'll be able to see that part of his research. I personally know Bruce from my time at UC Santa Cruz. That's where I did my PhD work. And I actually did my PhD looking at sea otter behavior and mating systems. And while Bruce is someone who focuses most of his research on birds, he has a really broad understanding of behavioral ecology and was able to really help me in understanding sea otter behavior. Bruce did his master's at Queen's University. He is from Canada, and for some reason, my department at Santa Cruz attracts a lot of Canadians, and he made it such that my committee was 50% Canadian. He also did his PhD at Princeton University, which is where I did my undergraduate work. So we've had lots of intersections, and I'm really excited to continue interacting with Bruce by bringing him in as a speaker for another birdie hour. Bruce, thank you so much for presenting for us. Please take it from here.
Thank you. Yeah, the Canadian thing is something funny. So you're seeing this. The Canadian thing is what my colleagues used to call the Canadian problem, as though the Canadians were taking over the department, and it's actually true. And second, I want to actually put in a plug for your next speaker. Chris Clark just gave that talk to our department, and it's totally spectacular. It will blow your mind. He's a great speaker. It's incredibly high tech and interesting stuff, but very accessible. So get the word out. It's going to be a phenomenal talk. It really is. You won't regret it. So break all records by supporting Chris's talk. Okay, so it's actually funny, in the chat, we were talking about underrated birds, the black phoebe, lots of different birds that people think about as underrated. And these are common birds that people take for granted. And today I'm going to tell you a story about a very common bird, the coot, that people take for granted and think it's boring. And it looks boring, but its behavior is anything but boring. And I'll do my thanks at the beginning. A big chunk of the work I'm going to talk about was helped by my former grad student, Dai Shizuka, who's now a professor himself. It takes a village to study coots, and we had large numbers of students join us in central British Columbia, and there was funding and a few families in British Columbia that let us work on their properties. So coots are underrated, and they also don't get no respect. So the older folks here will remember Rodney Dangerfield, who used to have a comedy skit, "I don't get no respect." And coots don't get no respect either. And in fact, in one of the dictionaries, one of my dictionaries at home, I got this quote, basically calling someone an old coot is an insult. It's like, oh, that stupid old coot. And so it's because we think of coots as stupid that we can use them as a slur to attack old people like me. But I hope to convince you by the end of the talk that if someone calls you a coot, you should take that as a compliment, that you are clever, you're interesting, you're the talk of the town. So here's Consider the Coot. And this is what a lot of people think about coots is it's dirt common. They're everywhere. So if you ask a birder if they saw anything interesting, if they saw coots, they might say, no, I just saw some coots. They're pests. California golf courses know coots very well. They leave little divots all over the golf course. They are excellent for feeding predators. Someone noticed that they're on the chat that the bald eagles in their area are being fed by coots. And above all else, they're boring. So they are dirt common, they are pests, they are really good for feeding predators, but I hope to convince you by the end of the talk that they're actually extremely interesting birds. Those of you that have looked on the surveys in the Bay, you've seen baby gulls. What I'm going to tell you now are 4 things that within the first month of studying coots caught my attention, that I realized that they're doing interesting things. And I approach science by looking at natural history, seeing interesting patterns and discoveries, and then trying to figure out the answer to those interesting questions. So I'm going to tell you about 4 questions that in my first year became the focus of studies. So if you've been looking for California gull chicks out in the Bay, they probably look a little bit like this. They're camouflaged. So when you see your first baby coot, that's a shock. And this is how I fell in love with coots. I found a baby coot in a marsh before I ever started studying them. And I saw this and I went, that's not natural. That's weird. And so even before I started my study, there was this question of like, why are baby coots so bizarrely colorful and ornamented? Anybody who's watched coots once they have chicks for more than 15 minutes sees them beating up their kids. And so most birds don't beat up their kids. And so that raised an interesting question, is like, why are coots beating up their kids? So this coot is not eating its baby, it's giving it a spanking. And I'll show you some videos. And the chicks aren't really harmed by this. They're just like a spanking. They just learn to behave themselves. And right from the second I started watching coots, I realized they fight nonstop. The animal behavior textbooks tell us that neighbors shouldn't fight, they should get along. That basically what coots do, coots forgot to read the textbooks in animal behavior, and they fight continuously with their neighbors through much of the breeding season. And if you take a close look, they're heavily armed. Those claws can hurt. I've had my hands ripped open when I trap birds. These are serious fights, and fights to the death have been reported in the literature. So that's an interesting question. Why are these birds fighting so much? What are they fighting over? And finally, in the first week of my project working on coots, I discovered that females were laying eggs in each other's nests. And this was a complete shock. And it was at that moment I completely changed the focus of my entire PhD, because discovering this was more interesting than what I had gone out to study. And so this was the focus of much of my PhD, but I will end with that rather than start with that. So we have 4 questions, and these are the questions that we'll reconsider the coot, is like the answer to these questions. Why are their babies so colorful and tacky? Why do they beat up these colorful babies? Why do the parents fight so much? And why are females laying eggs in each other's nests with reckless abandon? And a lot of these things interconnect. It's pretty interesting. So there are some fundamental drivers of coot biology that explain a lot of these things. To answer these questions, as Max said, I'm a behavioral ecologist, which means I'm interested in the evolution of behavior, or behavior as adaptation. So I take a strictly Darwinian perspective. And the questions I just said, laying eggs in each other's nests, colorful babies, I want to know why. When I say why are they doing this, it's how is this beneficial to the individuals doing this? Why does this make adaptive sense? And we might think of adaptation in terms of beaks of birds, but behavior can also be an adaptation. It's often genetic, and it's open to natural selection. So this was a perspective that I took. And just to put this framework into full perspective, because there's a lot of sort of confusion due to some bad nature shows, here's a classic question in evolutionary biology, which is, why do birds lay the number of eggs that they do? There's phenomenal variation. Here's a seabird, a gannet. A lot of seabirds lay a single egg. Coots have massive clutch sizes. And so trying to understand this variation in clutch size, we ask the question, why does a female bird lay the number of eggs she lays? Why doesn't the coot lay 1 egg? Why doesn't she lay 20 eggs? And the first attempt to get at this was some very influential work by David Lack. And he asked, at the time, European robins, but I put an American robin in the place. It's like, why do robins lay 4 eggs? Why not 5? Why not 3? And in some populations, all robins lay 4 eggs. And he thought about this. At the time, people explained robin clutch size by saying that's the best clutch size to lay for the good of the species. If they lay too much, they're going to starve the population. And it was basically birth control for the population. And David Lack pointed out, natural selection doesn't work that way. Natural selection is about how this parent robin, what's in it for it? What's the best clutch size for maximizing the number of genetic descendants it leaves? And so that's the perspective in all of this, is really thinking about the costs and benefits and how it might benefit the individual that's performing the behavior. In this case, when we say a clutch size of 4, the bird's body and brain is making a decision, not consciously, but that's what's under selection, is the machinery, the cognition, the brain, the physiology that causes a female robin to lay those 4 eggs. So when we say adaptive, the bird doesn't have to know it's doing this adaptively. It's just, why are those mechanisms in place that end up having females lay 4 eggs? And so to answer these questions that I've raised, and where I discovered them, in fact, is in central British Columbia. And so Vancouver's here, Seattle's here. This is sort of in the Wild West. It's full of cowboys and cows and some good wetlands. And so every year I would go up to central British Columbia with a crew to study coots. And this is their habitat. I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on the place, and then I'll outline the sort of topics I'm going to cover. So this is a typical coot marsh in early spring. These are the exact same bulrushes we get in central California, except these are dead ones from last year. This is early spring, so there's no green growth, and we're looking for coot nests there. Because I'm going to be talking a lot about coots, I wanted to just give you a flavor. This area has some spectacular birds. So even though I study coots, I'm a naturalist and a photographer, so I'm always taking pictures and looking for interesting birds of other species. These are eared grebes, a nice eared grebe floating around with its babies on its back in our coot marshes. Fantastic birds like breeding horned grebes, a relative of the eared grebe. Barrow's Goldeneye, which I think is one of the most beautiful birds in the world. Fabulous, just makes you feel like you're in the North Woods wilderness. Here's another evocative northern species. This may be my favorite bird on planet Earth, which is great gray owl. They're huge. They're skinny, so they're not as heavy as a great horned owl, but they're very tall. And we had them nesting near our study area, and it was always a treat to see these spectacular birds. And then finally, we had mating arenas, also known as leks, of sharp-tailed grouse nearby some of our study areas. So this is just to give you a flavor of, it's a cool place. Lots of water birds. So in addition to coots, there was lots of other things to satisfy naturalists and bird watchers. So here's the outline of my talk. I identified 4 questions, but those questions are not going to be the outline for the talk. I'm going to break it down into basically, first of all, to just give you a quick sense, how does a field biologist do this? How do you go out and what are you doing to collect data? And then I'm going to ask how to be a parent coot. And that's going to answer the question why they fight so much and why they beat up their chicks, because that's part of being a parent coot. And then once we've understood how to be a parent coot, we can answer 2 other questions, which is why coot chicks are colorful. The coot chicks are colorful in response to strategies and behaviors the parents have. And then why females lay eggs in each other's nest is also related to some of the constraints and limits on what it takes to be a parent coot. So it all does sort of connect together. So how to study coots, part 1. You have to find, the thing about driving all over the West is you have to find a place where there's birds and lodging. British Columbia was special. I haven't found a place in California that can rival my study area for the observability and densities of coots. So that's why I went to British Columbia and didn't study coots elsewhere, but it's in the middle of nowhere. So finding lodging was always difficult. But this was you got to stay in cool places like this. There was a pileated woodpecker nest right outside the kitchen. So I got to watch pileated woodpeckers feeding their babies 10 feet away when I washed the dishes. So dishes were not a chore. The way we start the field season is you systematically check the vegetation along the shorelines. Coots' nests are big and pretty easy to find. So you're just basically walking out in waders, systematically checking these wetlands. And the birds are very territorial. So once you find a nest, you can basically say, I've found the nest of this pair and move on. And so it's wonderful because the densities are enormous. Nests are easy to find. So we were finding anywhere from 80 to 100 nests or more a year. Once you find a nest, you visit it daily, you take notes. Here, Gina is measuring a coot egg. Measuring a coot egg is apparently a ridiculously fun thing to do, according to Gina's smile. And here, Justin is measuring, putting the data into a handheld little mini computer. We number all the eggs. This will become important later. So you go to Ace Hardware and get a Sharpie, and you can put a number on an egg so you can keep track of all of the eggs. We trap the birds, we trap them at night, and that's because for part of my study, I put tags on birds to make sure that I knew who I was watching, but that wasn't always necessary. Here's a caller, this is lucky number 7, and that's a neck collar to tell me that who that bird is. I didn't put colored bands on them because they swim so much, you can't really see the color bands, so that's why I opted to put neck collars. And then once everybody's tagged, I'll show you some tagged chicks in a bit. This is not an alien giant mushroom being. It's actually someone about to walk with a floating blind. This is a giant tractor tube with a plywood base put on it and a tent and camouflage put over it. And so we float around the marshes and get up close and personal with the coots. This is generation 2. This is the floating blind. It looks like natural vegetation. And when you make blinds like this, the birds get really, really tame. We've had bald eagles sit on top of our blinds. It's basically, hey, there's a muskrat house. So it's really fun. You're out there not just watching coots, but it's like being invisible in a marsh full of fabulous birds. And so as a photographer, I would always have my camera with me so I could, if something exciting came by, I could take pictures of it too. And this is taken with a normal lens. It's kind of maybe a very tiny zoom of a coot family. And we use these nape tags, little colorful tags that allow us within a family, the birds stay on their territory. So we just had to tag with these nape tags so we could follow the fates of individual chicks and look at which chicks are fed, how fast they grow, whether they're beaten up, and whether they survive. And so it's really focusing on individuals in families, known families on known territories. So that's basically the study. And now we're going to answer the question, and don't try this at home. With the question, how to be a parent, this is how to be a parent coot, and we'll leave that to the coots because as you'll see, what they do is probably not something humans should be doing. How to be a parent coot, you first have to find a partner. And my sense is that coots arrive at the breeding grounds with a mate, or they obtain a mate before they get a territory because it's really hard to obtain a territory. It takes two members of the pair to obtain a territory. To get a territory, you have to fight, and then to hold on to your territory, you have to fight. Coots fight nonstop, as I said, viciously, and both members of the pair fight. So you'll get 4 birds fighting. You'll get the males fighting the male, the female fighting the female, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Then they build a nest, lay a bunch of eggs, and as you can see, this nest is not that hard to find. And both members of the sex, both sexes help incubate the eggs and feed the babies and defend the territory. So it's really joint parenting. The only thing the female does that the male doesn't do is lay eggs. We haven't found males that lay eggs yet. They lay pretty large clutches. So this is a typical clutch size, 10 eggs, anywhere from 8 to 14 is a typical clutch size. Once the babies hatch, they are fed by their parents for the first 10 days, and that food is absolutely essential. Those babies cannot feed themselves. They're too buoyant. The parents are going underwater and swimming for aquatic, this is an aquatic insect larvae. It's got a damselfly larvae. The chicks just aren't able to get to the food. And so they're critically dependent on their parents for the food. If the parents don't feed them, they die. And early on after hatching, there's enough food. You can see these chicks, there's 4 chicks lined up waiting to get fed. This is it's a bit artificial because they don't line up always. They often follow the parents around. But as the chicks start growing, there's not enough food for everybody. 50% of the chicks in the population starve because they are not fed by their parents. And almost all families lose at least 1 chick. So this is the average, but there's a ton of variation. Some parents can raise all of their chicks, rarely, or most of their chicks, and some parents can raise few of their chicks. But basically, we find the babies, they've died of starvation, predators are not eating them, so the parents are laying more eggs than they can raise. And then they don't feed all their babies. So that then gets to the couple of questions within how to be a parent. Part of being a parent is making sure that there's enough food for the babies that they do have. And the fights are not rare. As I said, the literature tells us birds shouldn't fight so much, and especially with their neighbors. Once they've settled things down, most birds typically ignore their neighbors and respect each other. They basically fight with intruders coming in from elsewhere, but coots fight with their neighbors. And the nice thing is, when coots are done fighting, they have this display where they moon each other. So here's two pairs, they've just had a big fight. And when they're done, they flash, they basically show their fancy little white flags. And what they're doing here is they're saying, the fight's over and let's settle with this being the territory border. And so what they're fighting about is they fight at the borders. And so they're testing each other. And so once they fight, I can go over from inside my floating blind and put up flagging tape. This is fake flagging tape, but we basically go over and we mark the borders. And that's by doing that, we're able to determine the size of territories. And what you find is day after day, pretty much the territory borders are fairly stable. They'll be fighting at the same place, fighting like the Red Queen, running to stand at the same place. They're fighting for that territory border to be in the same place. So why do they care about maintaining their territory border? The reason they do that is because the only thing in all of the things I've measured that affects the number of babies that a pair of coots produces in a year is their territory size. Number of surviving chicks is something that natural selection cares very much about. That's basically what we call Darwinian fitness. The clutch size argument suggests that birds should be maximizing the number of chicks that they produce. And what this graph shows is the number of surviving chicks after all of that starvation as a function of territory size. Territories vary in size, and you can see there's a very nice positive relationship between territory size and number of chicks. Birds with small territories raise on average fewer chicks than larger birds with larger territories. So what I'm assuming is going on here, and it's a bit of conjecture, is that coots fight so much basically to maintain as big a territory as possible. Since how much turf you have controls how much food you have for the babies, and it's an incredibly valuable commodity. It directly connects, how much area they have connects to how productive they are, how many genetic descendants they leave, so it's worth fighting for. And so they're testing, I think they're probably just testing and making sure, and if their neighbors got weak, you might be able to steal some of your neighbor's territory and reduce the number of chicks that on your own territory that die of starvation. Now, why do coots beat up their kids? It's called tousling. It's been studied a little bit in Europe, in European coots, so I'm not the first to study it, but we've found some interesting patterns that are a bit different from what others have found. So what I'm about to show you is a video, and I'll turn the sound up to make sure that everybody can hear it. And what you're going to see is the parent is going to be feeding chicks, and then all of a sudden it just decides it doesn't like one of the chicks, and it's going to chase it, and it's going to grab it by the scruff of its neck, and it's going to shake the chick, and the chick's going to scream, don't spank me, and it's going to run away. So the parent's feeding, and it's just twisting the head, chick screaming. And once chicks are spanked, they stay away from the parents for a while. They basically, and at this point, this chick is probably big enough to feed itself. But once the spanking occurs, actually, the spanking is not about determining which chicks live or die, as we'll see. It's more, well, it's actually the spankers are not being punished so that they don't get fed and they starve. They're already doing pretty well. It's actually, as we'll see in a second, it's the parents are leveling the playing field. So it turns out to understand the spanking, we have to realize that a few birds, like coots and owls, stagger their hatching so that you get, they begin sitting on their eggs before they've laid them all, which means some chicks hatch way before others. Here's a short-eared owl family where I think there's almost like a 2-week spread between the youngest, which is still in an egg, and the oldest, which is now wandering around the grasslands, hiding away from the nest. And this asynchrony creates a competitive difference among the chicks. And the idea is that some birds use it to adjust family size to amount of food. So if this short-eared owl, for example, laid 1, 2, 3, 4, 8 eggs, but then there's only enough food for 4, the big ones will probably be the ones that survive. And so it's a way of hedging your bets. It's basically you can lay more eggs than you can raise, and you have this built-in disadvantage for the late hatch ones that they're surplus. If it's a good year, or you have a good territory, they make it. If not, they're runts that don't make it. And it turns out that coots also do that. So if you visit a coot nest, once the babies are hatching, you might see a pattern like this. You might see on day 1, 3 chicks hatch. And this is an actual nest pattern from a nest that I watched. Day 2, 2 more chicks hatch. Day 3, day 4, day 5. And so at this nest, there would have been 4 days difference in the age of the youngest and the oldest. In some cases, we can get up to 8 days difference between the youngest and the oldest. And this has consequences because it's the last chicks in that starvation. It's incredibly strong pattern that it's the late last hatch chicks that tend to be smaller because they're younger that are starving. So it fits with the idea that this is kind of a hedging your bets and call your brood if you can't make it. And so it turns out that there's 2 phases to being a coot parent. The first, early, as soon as the chicks hatch, the parents just are basically willing to feed anybody that can get to them. So the family goes around the wetland, and as the parent comes up, pops up from the water and has food like this damselfly, it's basically the first one there that gets fed. And big chicks can swim a lot faster than small chicks. So it's the big chicks that are basically getting to the food faster. And the parents allow that to happen for the first 10 days. And this is when the starvation happens. Basically, the little ones are starving, not because the parents are deciding selectively not to feed them, we think. It's because they just can't keep up. And so it's sort of a natural culling. And so this is what happens. So this is the first 10 days. It's a first come, first served. And that's when most of the starvation happens. But then it's like a switch goes off roughly at around 10 days. It's pretty dramatic. And this was work that my grad student took the lead on, Dai Shizuka. At about 10 days, suddenly the parents take control. This is when the spankings start. There's very few spankings in the first come, first serve phase, but all of a sudden, the parents decide to take control, and spankings are what allow them to take control. And they do something even more remarkable. They divide up the brood. This is called brood division. Mom takes her chicks, and for the rest of the season, she only feeds her own chicks. Dad has his chicks. He only feeds his chicks, which implies they can tell individual chicks. And so if Bobby here goes up to mom and goes for food, she'll just say, bugger off, I'm not feeding you. And they also divide the brood non-randomly, in which each parent takes the still alive runt. A lot of chicks have already died, but because of the hatching, the staggered hatching is so great, at the point when the parents take control, there's still smaller chicks and older chicks. And what the parents do is they divide the brood so that they have kind of each within their little units arranged. And then what the parents do is they preferentially favor the little guys. So this is, I put some aquatic insects here. So this little guy these little guys get fed, they get stuffed with so much food. The parents are basically playing catch up and leveling the playing field. It's kind of like they're saying to the older ones, you got it in the first come, first serve phase. Now we're going to favor the runts to try and help them survive. And so what we think they're doing is they're stopping the brood division, the brood reduction. They're stopping the starvation deliberately. They figured out I can raise 6 chicks, not 4, not 2, and they're using this parental control to do that. So what I'm going to show you is it turns out that the spankings are directed mostly at older chicks within each parent's thing, and they make sure they use this to ensure that the little guys get more food. So what you're going to see in this video is this really orange, newly hatched chick, and an older sibling that's also in this parent's group is going to come and steal food. The parent is about to feed its favorite chick. An older sibling steals food that was not intended for it, and it gets spanked for feeding food. The parents are basically saying, no, you don't get to steal food. And that way, and then after they spank that older chick will stay away for a couple of hours. It'll come back later and try and steal food, but it's basically the parents use this as a way to make sure that they get to feed the little guys. And you'll see the other chick is bigger and less orange because it's older. So this is the spoiled brat favorite chick there. Oh no, you don't. the little one is actually, they egg their parents on sometimes to make them beat them up harder. We call it pestering, but the little guys have a special, really annoying call. And when they give it, it just makes the parents beat up the other one even more. So the little ones are like manipulating their parents to beat up the competition. It's truly, truly staggering. So why are chicks so colorful? It builds on we're going to deal with this at two levels. And the first level is just simply like, what does this have to do with being a parent and the way that they reward food? Any of you that have studied birds know that when you think about ornamental plumage, you tend to think about adult birds like this mandarin duck or wood ducks or things. And that's because ornaments are usually involved with mating. Female mandarin ducks are very attracted to ornaments, and they will choose ornamented males as their mates. Clearly, a coot chick is too young. This is not anything, they're not mature. This has nothing to do with mating, and adult coots are not orange, so this has nothing to do with sort of mating things. It turns out that there's some interesting theory that was developed many years ago to talk about families like coots, which is when food is really limiting and parents are in control, if chicks could find a way to tap into what parents want to feed, ornamental traits might be a way to do that. And so this might be related to chicks finding ways in this really competitive world to increase their feeding by parents. And so here's the idea. The idea was actually applied to social insects. It had never been studied. And my colleague at John Eady at Davis and I realized that this applies to coots. So we set out to test this theory. And this theory is called parental choice. It's like mate choice in mating, but it's about parents having preference for ornamented offspring. So the idea is that if you have a system where parental food is critical to offspring survival, in coots that's true, if parents, for whatever reason, had a preference for feeding chicks with ornamentation, that could create a system where chicks become evolutionarily more and more ornamented because it's rewarded by the parental feeding. And so this could cause natural selection for the trait. So the critical thing, we already know that parental food is critical to offspring. We already know that parents control who gets fed. So the question that needed to be resolved was, do parents care about chick color? Is this chick color in any way connected to the decisions parents make in terms of feeding babies? And to do that, we did a plumage trimming experiment. And it turns out that these ornamental plumes are not the fluffy insulation that coot chicks need. They're weird spikes that grow above the functional stuff. So this trimmed baby coot, we give them a haircut. This trimmed baby coot actually looks like most normal rails. If you were to look at a black rail, a Virginia rail, this is what they look like, because this is a functional coot chick. They have added extra doodads on top of that. And so we created within each family 2 types of chicks. And we knew that on average, 50% of those chicks were going to die anyway. So we're a little bit playing God. We're not increasing the risk that chicks are going to die. We're just asking, can we determine which of the chicks are going to be winners in this lottery of a coot nest? And so then that's the question. We present parents with a choice. Half of their chicks are orange, half of them are less orange. Did it affect which ones lived and died? And it certainly did. It was a strikingly strong pattern. And what we found is the orange chicks within a brood were fed much more food than the trimmed ones. They grew faster than the trimmed ones, and they survived at a higher rate. And so these are connected. They got more food, so they grew faster, and because they got more food, they survived more. And so this was confirmation. This was the first confirmation that this kind of choice, that a choice mechanism that favors ornamental type traits that Darwin had talked about with peacocks, and we now study in sexual selection context, which is mate choice for ornamented males. This was the first evidence that this could happen within families in a non-mating context. And then it raises the question, so that's showing that parents care. More recently, we've been trying to figure out why might parents care and looking at natural variation in chick color. And so this is like getting at the next question, like, why would parents care in the first place? And it turns out that we found some interesting patterns when it came to the parental control and favoritism phase. Recall that parents favor the youngest. And so the hypothesis that we have is that plumage might be an honest indication of how young or how small a chick is, because as they grow, they don't grow any more orange feathers. These orange feathers are what they get from the nutrients that the mother puts in the yolk. And then after that point, those coot chicks are not growing any more new orange feathers. As a chick grows, it gets bigger. The same amount of orange feathers get diluted over a bigger body, and they also fade with age. And so it could be that these ornamental signals are an honest indicator of parents of which chicks are the youngest and in need of getting food. And we've just shown very recently that if you look at natural coloration, there is variation within broods of coots, and the more orange chicks amongst the survivors are the ones that are more likely to be chosen as the favorites, which connects this, it sort of ties it all together, which is that this color probably does connect somehow to the parental strategies and the chicks responding evolutionarily by growing feathers that tap into the sorts of rules and preferences that the parents have. All right, I think we're down to one last question. And now we're getting to actually what was the entire focus of my PhD thesis. The other stuff was all done after my PhD or in separate projects. And so coots have been very good to me. There's a lot of rich questions. And so one tiny part of this talk is a subset of the questions I was able to ask about brood parasitism. So here we have a coot nest with eggs from 2 females. And the owner of the nest has these pale white ones, and some other female coot has snuck these brown eggs into this nest. And the way that we know that this happens is you can use genetics. At the time, the genetic techniques for getting this going were just getting going, and I didn't want to devote 90% of my thesis work to becoming a lab rat. I was able to take advantage of a cool bit of information that's well known in birds that allowed me to detect brood parasitism without resorting to genetics. And that has to do with physiology of laying. We know a lot about how birds form eggs and lay eggs. And for all wild birds, there is no exception to this. No female bird in the wild can lay more than 1 egg in 24 hours. It's because of the way that eggs are formed in the machinery. There's one yolked up ovule that gets in the female's reproductive in her oviduct, and then an egg is done, and that takes 24 hours. And then when that egg is laid, she'll start the process again. So what that means, this is a big physiological constraint. When you find a nest, remember we were checking nests every day. We were numbering all eggs with Sharpie and the markings don't come off. They're there permanently. So when you check nests and then you come to a nest and there's 2 new eggs since yesterday, you're sure that 2 females have laid eggs. And when I detected this, almost always I could tell the eggs apart. One of the eggs, I'll show you a real example. One of the eggs looks like the rest in the nest and one doesn't. And then you finish checking the nest. So that's basically getting 2 or more eggs per day tells you that 2 females have laid in those nests. And then when you compare the eggs, you can usually figure out which one is the odd egg out. Much less common is when birds lay after a female has done laying and she's sitting. So here's a nest. I'm putting in small clutch sizes so we don't have to have an endless series. But here's a nest where the female laid 4 eggs and she was incubating and everything was dandy. And then partway through incubation, this egg just shows up out of nowhere. And here's another thing. Birds don't take big gaps when they're laying eggs. They might skip 1 day, but birds do not typically skip a bunch of days and then start laying again. And so these layings, this new eggs well after the clutch is complete was also an indication that 2 females. I should point out that a close colleague of mine did a very similar study with gallinules, moorhens in Europe. We call them gallinules in North America. And she used this technique, but she also used genetics. And she found 100% congruence, accuracy between the genetic techniques and what I've talked about here. So she used all the same field techniques to identify parasitized nests. And when she used genetics, she got exactly the same answer. So it's a very accurate thing that can be backed up with genetics. So here's a real example when I basically photographed all my nests. So here's a nest and these two eggs. The host laid this egg on day 7 and this egg was laid along. One of these is not like the other. I've handpicked this as an extreme case. And so this one looks like all the others. But if you look, P means parasite. There was another parasite in this clutch that's a lot harder to tell, but if you get good at looking at eggs, you can see actually this is a bit smaller, it's a bit shinier, and the spots are quite a different pattern. So in some cases, you have to stare a little bit in more depth at the egg to figure it out. There were cases where I couldn't tell, so I was always cautious. If I came to cases where it's like, I'm not confident, I would just say, I'm gonna put those in a bin where I say, I don't know which egg is the parasite. But I think something like in 97% of the cases, I could sort of say, yes, I can tell. So based on this is a bit of data. Hopefully it's not overwhelming, these numbers. I found a large number of coot nests, over 400 nests in my 4-year study. 40% of all nests received eggs from more than one female. So this is a common strategy. Basically getting upwards of 50% of the nests are receiving eggs from other females. And in terms of all of the eggs laid in the population, 13% of all eggs laid by coots in my population end up in somebody else's nest. So, and I point that out because that means that this is a common strategy. It's not rare. If it were super rare, you might attribute it to just accidents and occasionally screwed up birds. But in this case, we're pretty clear that it's common enough that it deserves to have an explanation. So now, because it's common, we can ask the question, why would a female do this? How would it benefit the females? How would it allow a female to increase the number of genetic descendants she leaves, as opposed to had she not laid those eggs? And so that was sort of my thinking about, given the context, and to understand that, to ask why it would be adaptive for a female, you have to first of all figure out who are the females doing this and what's their reproductive situation. But first, it was important, I've told you that these are parasites. Acorn woodpeckers, my friend Walt Koenig and all of his colleagues that have been studying acorn woodpeckers for 40 years, this is a bird we all know, they live in social groups, and often a mother and sister will be on the same territory and lay eggs in the nest. So if they were to apply my criteria, they'd say, oh, look, there's brood parasites, but actually in acorn woodpeckers, it's cooperative groups of relatives. What I found in my tagging study, these are not collared birds, but when I collared the birds, I found that there was only ever one male and one female on a territory. Coots are not acorn woodpeckers. Those eggs are coming from someone off the territory, so they are not relatives, they are not helpers at the nest. These are classic parasites. To figure out who the parasites are, I took advantage of another cool thing about American coots is their eggs are very different. These are eggs from different females, largely, and you can see there's tremendous variation in shape, background color, and the size and color of spots. And it turns out that these are really consistent within a female and really different among females. Actually, when I measure these characteristics and feed them into a computer and ask a computer, match up eggs laid by the same female in a nest based on these features, the computer gets it accurate very, very to a high degree. And so I'm not just making this up. So here's eggs laid from 5 different females lined up. Each column is a female, and you can see there's differences in shape. Some are longer, some are squatter, background color, the size of the spots. Here's something with big blotchy spots. Here's something with tiny spots. And so this kind of variation allows us to figure out whether we can match that egg to another female in the population. And the way we do that, here's Jason again. Jason, I think I called him Justin earlier. I'm sorry, Jason. Jason has some parasitic eggs in this egg case, and he's carrying them around to compare other nests to see if he can find the female that laid those eggs. And we can do that if the female has her own nest. So you just go around, and I'll show you a little dorky little, here's a little neighborhood, and with three neighbors surrounding this coot, and she has this parasitic egg. So basically we take the egg to the neighbor and say, is it a match? No. Is it a match? No. Is it a match? Yes. And it's usually that simple, because in 90% of the cases, when the parasite is a female with her own nest and territory, she's a next door neighbor. And also what we find out is if we were to compare this egg, parasites lay parasitically just before they start their own nest. So this female, our records would have shown that this female might have laid this egg on May 1st, and then she went to her own nest and started laying May 2nd, May 3rd, May 4th. So everything is lined up in a nice, tidy chronological order. And so it all fits. There were cases where we just weren't comfortable at deciding one way or the other. But in many cases, in this case, this would be a very distinctive egg. If there was no other egg that looked like this in the population, we were comfortable by saying that female doesn't have a nest on this population. And so it turned out that there were two different contexts in which parasites were laying eggs in other females' nests. In 75% of the cases where we were pretty sure, it was a female that had her own nest that laid some of her eggs in her neighbor's nest. And as I said, she did that before she began laying in her own nest. But in about a quarter of the cases where we felt really comfortable in making this call, those eggs were not laid by a nesting female in our population, but were laid by non-breeding females. And what's interesting is that the two lakes where we had the highest frequency of parasitism by these non-nesting females, there were actually, you could see those groups of non-nesting females. Here's a group of non-breeders. The territories are full. The reason that coots fight for territories is because they are packed in and not everybody gets a territory. So there's far too few resources for everybody to breed, and some birds, probably young females, aren't able to establish a nest and territory. And so they're resorting to parasitism. And so I'm going to answer the question in reverse order. Let's start first with these non-territorial females. Why do they lay eggs in the nests of other females? They're also called floaters. Floaters are birds that are unable to get a nest, so they float around the population. And the options for these females are to sulk and get no eggs that year, or to try and squeak out a few eggs and basically get a bonus. And so what the choices they're making is nothing versus something. That's called making the best of a bad job. And so the habitat is full, no territories. So basically the parasitism for these birds is their only option for reproduction that year. And as long as eggs are cheap enough, if they get some babies out of it, it's better than doing nothing. So if they had a bumper sticker, their bumper sticker would say, I'd rather be nesting, but they can't nest. And so this is plan B, given that they can't nest. These females would probably be nesting if they could get a territory, but they can't. Harder to explain is why females with their own nests lay eggs in the nests of others, because they've got their own nest. Why not just lay those eggs in their own nest? And to help you understand that, I'm going to give you just a couple of slides on the behavior and then wrap this up. 25% of all females that have nests lay eggs in somebody else's nest. They can lay anywhere from 1 to 10 eggs parasitically. They almost always lay parasitically just before they begin their own nest, and they parasitize close neighbors. And this might be a pattern. So here's actually, this is true data from a bird. This female laid 3 eggs in neighbor A, then she laid 2 more eggs, and these are in consecutive days, 2 eggs in neighbor B, and then she looks like she laid 8 eggs in her own nest. So this is an actual coot pattern, all in a row, 1 egg per day. And so it turns out that when you look at the clutch sizes, that's the number of eggs laid, what parasites are doing is they're not laying fewer eggs in their own nest. they're laying extra eggs to lay parasitically. And so what they're doing is getting bonus surplus babies. They lay as many eggs in their nests as they can feasibly raise. They can't even raise those all. And given coots can be egg factories, some of these birds could lay 30 eggs in 30 days. And so that given that eggs are cheap, if your neighbor happens to be nesting before you and you can get some eggs in, you go and do it. And so you're basically getting additional free babies that somebody else has to lay. If this bird were to lay these extra eggs in her own nest, she would just be increasing starvation because there's basically maybe enough food for 5 babies. If she adds those eggs to her own territory, they may live, but they'll cause the starvation of other babies. And so by putting them in somebody else's territory, you let them worry about that. And so it's extra. So one last thing about the brood parasites is this is really good for the parasite, but it's bad for the host. When somebody's laying eggs in your nest, you can't raise all of your own babies, so you sure don't want to raise somebody else's. So they have some interesting tricks up their sleeve, and I'll just talk about one of them. Coots are actually pretty good at visually looking at these eggs and going, you know what? I don't like those white ones. They don't look like mine. And they bury them down in the nest material. And so those buried eggs don't get incubated and they don't hatch. And so they use this as a defense. They get about 30% of the parasitic eggs these ways. And an even more fascinating story, but there's not time for it here, is they can sometimes learn to recognize their own chicks, and they will kill off brood parasitic chicks after hatching. It was a remarkable study by my former student, Dai Shizuka, and it's pretty amazing. And so there's the rejected eggs. So to wrap up, and I just want to briefly have 3 slides about a new project on coots. I hope I've convinced you to reconsider the coots, that they do a lot of interesting things. They fight, it's not gratuitous. They overproduce babies, but it's for a good cause, maximizing the family genetic lineage. They beat up their kids. It's actually bad for the beaten up kids, but good for the chicks they help. They do interesting things like divide their brood. They have tacky orange chicks, but it kind of makes sense in a weird way. And they play a great egg scrambling game where they put eggs in each other's nest, but that actually makes sense in light of the parental care constraints. So hopefully next time you go out in a marsh, you'll think about coots in a whole new light. So that's the end of this story. I will come back in a couple of years and give you another talk because I'm just starting a brand new, everything I've learned about American coots makes me think that there are some other coot species that would be really interesting to think about whether what I found for American coots is general. And I think that it's probably not, that there's going to be variations on the theme. And so I'm very excited. I went to South America, to the high Andes, wetlands like this that have tons of flamingos. These are coot nests. These are species of coots that nest in the high Andes. And there's 2 species, and I'm focusing on one of them. And here's my Argentinian colleagues surveying a marsh for a species I'll show you in a second. It's an endangered bird. So unlike American coots, which are anything but endangered, this horned coot is a very threatened species. It's found in the high Andes at 5,000 meters, fairly local populations. And my Argentinian colleagues are leading this project. I'm helping out with them to do a giant tagging study using satellite tags to look at the connection between all of these wetlands in Chile and Argentina. And so we're looking for grants, but if somebody has a passion to support high Andes research on various charismatic birds, get in touch with me and we can talk about getting in touch with my Argentinian colleagues. And with that, I think we're at the end, and I was within half an hour, and I'm happy to stay on for questions. Serena, if there's time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bruce. I feel like I just got this look into the secret lives of coots. It was really amazing. So we'll start with our first question from Crab Cove. In the San Francisco Bay Area, where do coots go to nest?
I'm not sure. We'd need to tag them. Some of them are local, but coots are not territorial in winter. You'll notice that they get together in big groups, which is true for a lot of territorial birds. I think we get a mix in winter of local birds and migrants from further north. The birds in BC do migrate, and some of them, based on tag recoveries, do come to the West Coast. So I think that some of those could be from anywhere in the north. could be Alaska, British Columbia, Alberta, and some of them are resident. But we'd have to actually do a tagging study to really nail that down.
Great. And Perry asked, the territory size that you showed, there was a chart where you showed how the territory size is related to, I think, nest success and
number of babies produced. Yep.
Number of babies. So the territory size was in meters and not in square meters. Is that correct? Does that mean that you measure the size in linear area along the reeds?
That's a great point. Some years we measured, because it's hard to get the borders out in the open water, but we did that in some years. But in some wetlands, they're defending linear strips along the wetland shore. And most of the variation is, we think, in territory size is due to that linear thing. So yes, we're measuring their shoreline property, and it may not be perfect, but it predicts very well. So we think we're getting something meaningful. But in other years, we actually did measure area. That's in the second phase of the study after GPS had been invented. And we were able to actually then get very accurate estimates using GPS estimates of area, and it basically shows the same pattern. The patterns are no stronger, no less strong. So, but it's very perceptive that you notice that.
Yeah, and then the next question is from Aaron. Have you been able to determine if older pairs tend to have larger territories than younger first-time parents?
Yes, I've looked at that because it turns out my birds don't come back. It's basically they're at that wetland for 1 year and then they go somewhere else. It's like they're not very site faithful, but you can age coots by their leg color. This has been worked out. And so it's an approximate aging scheme. Their legs get more colorful with age. So based on that aging scheme, I had what I called an age index. Older birds they don't have bigger territories. I can't actually explain why some birds have bigger territories. I tried to answer that, but there is an interesting twist. The brood parasites are more likely to be older females. Older females can lay more eggs, and so parasites are more likely to be older, and even among parasites, older females can lay more eggs. So I think females are just more experienced and more fecund. So the age thing is picked up not on territoriality, but the other way of getting babies by dumping your eggs on somebody else.
Interesting. And then Perry asked, why don't other birds have colorful chicks? In other words, why isn't the same system of having bright chicks used in other birds?
A few birds do. Grebes have very patterned chicks, and there's a lot of parental control, and grebe chicks beat each other up. The chicks beat each other up. There are a few birds with colorful plumage, but not very many. And I think it's just the natural history. This is a weird case where you've got a lot of things converging. You've got the parents having very staggered hatch. You have parents using control, and you have an extreme amount of brood reduction starvation. The starvation we see in coots is extreme. That sets the stage for very high evolutionary rewards for anything the chicks can do to avoid being the starved chicks. So I think the battleground, the lottery is just a lot more strict. There's fewer winning tickets in coots, and that sets the stage. But I'm speculating. But there are a few cases where there are ornamented chicks, but it's the exception rather than the rule. But actually, I might point out, many birds are ornamented on the inside. Songbirds open their mouths and display to their parents and beg and scream, and that's, screaming is a signal. Opening your bright red beak is a signal. And so in a sense, they're ornamented, but they're ornamented in a different way. They're ornamented in the way that they can turn off. So a baby songbird can shut its mouth and be quiet. Coots, they don't beg. It wouldn't be that attractive. So they're basically begging all the time, full on. It's basically the lights are always on. And so I think that's a way to think about it, is it's not that other birds aren't ornamented, but like, why would you do it with feathers? And naked skin? Baby coots they're bald like me, except they can make their head turn bright red. And when baby coots turn bright red, the top of the head is actually the same color as the feathers. So there's some kind of synchrony between the naked signal on the top of the head and their color, which I think is telling us a little bit about what's going on there, but I won't go down that rabbit hole today.
Wow, so interesting. And then Yvonne asked, how does a female coot decide which nest to lay their egg in? Is there a rule? And I know you mentioned it was their neighbors, but is there anything else you want to add there?
Yes, I have a whole paper on this. You can actually ask of the neighbors, did coots make non-random decisions? And you can do what's called Monte Carlo models. Monte Carlo is like going to Monte Carlo and you roll the dice. You can create models like that and say, I'm going to make this female lay her eggs randomly, not what she did, and see if the choices she made actually differ from had she laid them randomly. So it might be that she laid her eggs non-randomly in a big territory, or in an older pair, or in a territory that produced more babies. And I looked at everything under the sun, and they're basically not making non-random choices. And I think it's because usually they don't have a lot to choose from. Often at most, they might have one or two neighbors that are nesting before them, because they don't wait. And so they have a nest to parasitize is one that's going before you have to lay your own nest. So there's a seasonal component of this. So basically, most females don't have much to choose from, but they do something smart. They know when to stop laying. If a female lays eggs in 3 nests, she'll typically lay 3 eggs in this one, not 10, and then 3 here and 3 here, because that simple rule works across the board, which is it's stupid to lay 5 eggs in the same nest. They're just going to compete with each other. So they seem to know. And if they have more hosts, they put fewer eggs in the same nest to avoid SIB competition. So it's not the game they're playing is not who's the best parent, but how can I maximally spread these eggs among nests to maximize their success? And they play that game very well.
Cool.
So they're good at the gambling game.
Yeah. And maybe this is also related, but Kate asked, how does the female coot manage to get to someone else's nest when they're so territorial?
I wish I could answer that for coots. I brought to Canada some really crappy night vision goggles back before then, when the technology was not great, and spent many nights freezing out in the middle of the marsh because the birds are laying eggs at night. And I heard a lot of noise, but I didn't see much of anything. A friend of mine the woman I told you about, Sue McRae, who worked on moorhens in England, had much more luck. She was able to video camera a whole bunch of moorhens laying parasitically. She caught it in action, and it was the same story every time. Male moorhens are on the nest at night, and we believe in coots it's probably the same. Parasites come up, even though the males on the nest, they can probably sneak in to the territory undetected, but the males on the nest. So the female would sneak up, sit beside the male, and while he is beating the crap out of her, really like pecking and beating her up, she squeaks out an egg and leaves. And then the male goes, there's an egg here, I better adopt it. So I'm assuming the same thing as it happens in coots. And actually, I found that females that tended to be wimpier in body size were less successful at parasites, and I assume it's because they may not be able to get access to their neighbors.
Okay. And then Yvonne asked if the spots on their eggs are called decorations in coots.
You can call them what you want. I mean, they're called maculations or spotting, and it may help in camouflage. I think it's natural variation. Again, there's theory to suggest you might go, wow, are they doing this to tell their eggs apart? And if you actually think about it, every female is both a host and a parasite. And so what she gives, she gets in return. And so having distinctive eggs actually doesn't help you, because in your lifetime, you're going to be laying eggs in somebody else's nest. You're also going to be receiving them. So it kind of balances out. So I think it's just natural variation that we see in populations. But what I think happens is females probably are under strong natural selection to lay really consistent eggs, because the more consistent the eggs, because there's some evidence that birds learn their eggs by looking at them and imprinting. And if you've got a really consistent egg, you've got a brand. And it's kind of like, yeah, all my eggs look like this. If you're laying like all sorts of different types of eggs, it's like you're going to be really bad at recognizing somebody else's eggs. So I think there's been strong selection for females to really lay consistent eggs, which then makes it look like there's more variation among females because of their, each female has her own little egg type.
Perry asked, do nests get parasitized early, thus having birds hatched first, or is it more uniform?
They rarely, because they don't incubate till about the fourth egg, parasites are never the first to hatch, but they can hatch along with the host eggs on the first day. So, and then the eggs are laid randomly with respect to the host laying cycle, but because neighbors tend to be synchronized, the eggs tend to be, it looks non-randomly like, oh, they're better able to target these nests during laying than incubation. But actually, if you do the Monte Carlo sort of games, it's like they're just laying at random. It just happens that little local neighborhoods are synchronized, more likely to be sort of at the same stage.
And then going back to egg patterns, Laura asked, if there's so much variation among eggs, why are female coots that are being parasitized unable to identify eggs from another female? You did touch on this, but is there more you want to add there?
Yeah, there's two answers, and I can speculate. I know for one thing is eggs that are really different from the host get recognized, and not all, and it may be that they have to be different enough, and at some point they're just not different enough. I've already shown that I can predict to some degree which eggs are rejected, but it's not the entire story. And it may be that some of these birds are young birds that haven't learned their own eggs, and then if you end up getting somebody else's egg, your learning gets messed up. Might be like, oh wait, these are mine. And so it could be a mixture of that, and there's variation across individuals and just how good they are. So there any number of things. Oh, but the other thing is some of this is also tactical. Birds are less likely to reject when they only get one parasitic egg because it's not as costly. So the parasitism rate, the probability that the bird will reject any eggs at all goes up when there's more, because it's more of a threat. And eggs that are laid after incubation that are not threatening are much less likely to be rejected. So they're able to kind of like somehow collect information, and they're much more responsive when they're laid parasitized early because those are threatening. And so I think that explains some of the variation, is even if they've got this glaringly different egg, it's kind of like, yeah, but it was laid 5 days after mine, so I don't need to bother with it.
Wow, interesting. And then Linda asked, will a single female lay eggs in more than one other nest? And you said yes, right? They do?
Yes, I think the maximum was 5. Probably most it's 1, 2 or 3, but in extreme cases, it's up to 5 nests. And I've had some nests that are parasitized by 5 females. I had one nest with 23 eggs and 6 females, the owner and 5 parasites laid in it. And it was a complete mess trying to figure that one out. When you have 4 new eggs since yesterday, it's like, oh my God.
The next question is from Yvonne. Who are the fathers of the eggs laid in other nests when that female doesn't have her own nest?
We did a tiny genetic study to look at this, and I'd say it's preliminary, but the reason we wanted to get at this is because some people suspected that maybe the parasite mates with the male at the nest, and those are his babies. It doesn't actually make a lot of sense, but we tested that, and these females have their own mates. So I think that they're paired because they're paired hoping to get a territory. That's because you can't get a territory on your own, and they end up not getting a territory. So it looks like the brood parasites probably have their own partner. That's also a non-breeding, but it's not the nest owner male, as far as we can tell from a small sample.
And then I think you answered this one as well. Yvonne asked, is there nest fidelity in terms of the location from year to year? And you said that they're not really coming back, right?
In British Columbia, they're not because they're migratory. In California, I think that they are resident, but the nest disappears. So they would probably be faithful to their territory. They may even defend territories year round, but they would probably, because the vegetation dies back, they're probably not going to nest in exactly the same place. And the nests disappear pretty fast. They're sort of floating on the water, they rot down, and the birds actually have to keep building them up even during the breeding season because the bottom part is often damp and the nesting material rots. So they might be faithful in California to the territory, but certainly not the nest. But in Argentina, those nests I showed you are built on top of what can be a ton, a literal ton of rocks. Those high Andes birds make a foundation, like this nest you can see here. Under this nest is a massive little volcano of rocks. And they will use those years after year because moving a ton of rocks is pretty extensive. So they will use those exact same sites because they built a little nest platform out of boulders underneath it. So differences among species.
And then Yvonne also asked if you can genetically follow a single female who has laid eggs parasitically for a year. Are they expanding and expanding their gene pool in a single lake?
I can't study those females, but we're doing a study in wood ducks in California with a colleague at Davis, and we are doing the genetics, and we are able to follow these females, and the females are all pit tagged, which is the things that you put in your pets. And we have all the duck boxes rigged with readers. So we know everything. And it turns out that the babies come back to where they were born. So we've built up this population of females that we know from the day they hatched, what they've done. And so, yes, we're going to use that to look at the variation. So almost certainly by laying eggs in other birds' nests, you are increasing the number of genetic descendants you leave. But stay tuned. At some point, my colleague or I could give a talk on this with wood ducks, because that's a system where we actually have the genetic tools to answer that question. But it's a great question.
Yeah, I'm sure we'd love to hear about that when you have the results. So the next question is also from Yvonne. Are the parents selective in terms of the sex of the chicks? So are males or females being favored, being taken to maturity?
No, we actually looked at that. My student developed a way to use genetics, a simple genetic marker, to figure out the sex of the chicks, because we thought that might be an important story here. Absolutely no pattern. There may be other things going on with the sex of kids, but as far as the dividing up the brood, there was no clear pattern that he could detect.
And then Laura asked if coots are monogamous.
When you say monogamous, there's two ways to get at that. One is within a year. So lots of birds that are migratory don't end up mating with the same bird across years because both don't usually survive, and so there's basically, often you can see monogamy within years, but not monogamy over the lifetime. I can say nothing about lifetime because I haven't followed them, but I can say within a year, they are faithful. Our genetic study suggests that the male at a nest sires all of the chicks that his mate lays. So that there's basically there's no hanky-pank. That's an important question in birds, is like, is there hanky-pank where the female mates with the neighbor or the male goes off and mates with the neighbor? We don't have evidence of that in coots. So they are not only socially monogamous, but they're faithful in terms of their mating pattern and who genetically is the parent of those babies.
And then Perry asked if there are other bird species that also practice nest parasitism.
Yes, there are. There's two flavors of parasitism. There's the across species. So many of you know about the cowbird and cuckoos. That's a cross species, and that's found in 100 species of birds. So cowbirds are professional parasites. They never, ever have their own nest. And cuckoos never have their own nest at the species. So there's 100 species. We've now documented what I've shown for coots with 250 species of birds. So 250 species of birds have this within species reparasitism. And it's found in a bunch of different groups, in various songbird groups. Starlings do this a lot. Weaver birds in Africa do it a lot. Grebes do it to a fair amount. Waterfowl, it's rampant. This is particularly common in waterfowl like ducks and geese. And it's common in all of the coots that people have looked at so far, except we're not sure of horned coots. We're actually thinking that it might not occur in horned coots, which is one thing that caught my attention. But in 4 other species of coots, other than mine, that have been looked at, there's some level of within species egg trading going on.
Linda wants to know how long coots generally live.
We don't know. I think there might be one study in the literature, but it's not that long. I think that, birds that lay a lot of eggs tend to have lower adult lifespans. There's this pattern of whether you have a slow life history, like seabirds, where the parents live a long time and produce a small number of babies. Coots seem to have a fast life history, lots of babies, but I'm suspecting the parents don't live that long. It might be, 2 or 3 years on average. It really, and it would probably vary a lot on whether they're resident or migratory. I've actually thought I should probably start tagging, even if I can't study nests in California. It might be interesting to tag a few resident birds, because they do breed in locally in wetlands, not huge numbers, but it'd be interesting to get that data. First of all, do they return? Are they here year round? And what's their lifespan? So it's a good question. It might motivate me to get out and study some of the local coots.
Nice areas of future research.
Yep.
And then the next question is from Jaslyn, who asked, is there a relationship between chick decoration and predation? Is starvation just more of an issue amongst coot chicks than chick predation?
Yes, and that's a good point that gets back to the early question, why aren't there more birds ornamented? There is some predation on coot chicks, but I did a pretty detailed study, and most of the mortality is starvation. If you actually look at that, once they get to a certain age, they have a really good survival rate. And I think it's because the parents are vigilant and the chicks get really good at hatching. Once the chicks hatch, we can't recatch them. They're impossible to find. Because of the parents' alarm call, the chicks just get and hide underwater with their beaks just poking up, and you can look through the territory forever and just never find them. So I think as long as the parents are vigilant, one of my students did see a peregrine falcon snatch a baby off the water. So it does happen, but my sense is that it's way, way rarer than starvation.
And then Yvonne asked if the maculations on the eggs are pigmented by melanin. Do you know?
I don't know, and I don't think so. Eggs have different kind of pigments than feathers. There's bilirubin. I should know this stuff, but the browns, some of them are not. Certainly the background colors not. The black ones might be, but there may be other ways of making black. I should actually talk to my colleagues that actually work on the physiology of color to find out if that's true, what it is, because it's probably known, and I just don't know that. But I know that eggs do have different, like robin eggs are made with bilirubin, which is related to bile and some of those products. So I know that when I teach this in ornithology, egg pigments are often different from feather pigments, for example.
Cool. And then, earlier you were talking about how the females that don't have a nest are likely mating with males, not the ones that are on the nest. So yep. Kate said, wait, what? Females with no nest have mates that have no nest?
I'm just seeing that. Yeah, I think it makes sense because, as I said, I think they have to pair up early in spring just to be able to be in the pool of getting a territory. Because if you try to get a territory by yourself and two other birds come along, two birds fighting against one, it's over. So I think it's basically because both males and females help defend the territory. Just to get a lottery ticket, there has to be two of you, which means you have to pair up. And then once you're paired, some of them wait. I think the story's a little bit more complicated. A few of the floaters eventually do get a nest, because what happens is out in the middle of these lakes, if it's shallow enough, late in the season, some vegetation grows up and it's kind of like, hey, a territory. They need vegetation to nest. A territory opens up. And so occasionally what's a floater is like bonus is like, hey, I can nest out in the middle of that lake. And so one of the reasons they may stay paired is they may just be hoping, maybe somebody will die. And so, because floaters are known, if you do experiments in birds and you remove a territory owner, floaters will fill that vacancy as soon as you can say lickety split. So they're out there hoping to fill in a territory. And so that may be why they're mated and hanging out. And also, the male gets as many genetic descendants. Every time a female lays a parasitic egg, that's one of his. So why wouldn't he mate with her? It's like, let's go make babies and make somebody else pay for them.
And then Yvonne asked, do the parents feed the chicks only invertebrates?
Almost entirely. They need protein. So the parents eat pond scum, and occasionally, so the parents can eat just all this stuff that I wouldn't have thought as being nutritious. There's some plants, and I forget the family, that are pretty nutritious and high in protein. And occasionally I've seen parents feed the chicks specifically that plant. But almost always, we took a lot of data on what they're eating. damselfly larvae, caddisflies. Caddisflies are these insects underwater that build little shells out of rocks and stuff. And I can always tell when a coot's got a caddisfly because it has to spend like a minute trying to shake the grub out of its house. So it's pretty straightforward. Oh, that's a caddisfly. It's got to shake it out of the house. So yes, I would say probably at least 95% of the prey is invertebrates. Because if it was pond scum, the babies could feed themselves. They wouldn't need the parents.
All right.
Oh, and actually that's interesting point. I think a dynamic of this system is because the parents eat vegetation, the resources the parents need for eggs, pond scum, is very different from what it takes to feed the babies. And so I think that's why eggs are cheap and babies are expensive. And I think that that diet difference may in part explain why brood parasitism is so common in the system, because eggs are driven by one set of nutrients, but raising those eggs takes a different one.
And then Yvonne asked, what is the physical tactic that coots use when they're fighting? Are they trying to wound each other's chest?
They lie on the back and they kick with their feet. And so, yeah, I think it's unclear to me why they have to fight rather than just a lot of animals will just, they have ways of assessing, are you still strong? Let's do a threat display. So it's a bit, the fact that they interact with their neighbors so much makes sense, but why it's fights rather than some display? Because a display, it's like show off, show me how strong you are. So I don't really know. Maybe the chances are you could wound them and then they're gone and you get their territory. So it may be actually you're trying to get rid of them. I'm just guessing here. But what's interesting is they do get wounded because it seems like often after the female's done laying, I'll come to a nest, there's blood on the eggs. And I'm inferring like the female must have got raked on her brood incubation patch and come back and bled on the eggs.
Well, I think that is the last question that I'm seeing in the chat right now. So first of all, thank you everybody who has stuck around and asked all those great questions. And thank you again, Bruce, for this great talk. So Bruce, I want to ask you if there is anything else you want to say to everybody before we sign off. No,
thanks for coming out. Great questions. And the turnout exceeded 100. So that was pretty amazing. So
yeah.
that was great. So thank you. Thanks for your interest and thank you for advertising it as a group. And again, do try and get as many people as you can for Chris's talk. It's truly it's absolutely spectacular what he's able to do. And it's so interesting.